Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala parasha. This week we have the schos of reading parashas Vaera. And Vaera obviously is the home base for the makos, right? Most, I think 7 of the makot appear in parashat Vaera. And so themes relating to the makot and how God did it and what the plan was, they come up necessarily in this week's parasha. And I want to focus on them. And to a certain extent, it seems like the ones I've chosen to focus on today also reveal something about the Ramban. The Ramban obviously came after Rashi and came after the Ibn Ezra. Rashi, he has open love for. The Ibn Ezra slightly less. The Ramban in Sakdama says, I have tochacha geluya va'ahava musteret, right? I have open love. I'm sorry, I have open tochacha for the Ibn Ezra, but privately I love him. And they're all different shitas of this. But this week we'll see where the Ramban uses ideas that we think we saw in Rashi and that we think we saw in the Ibn Ezra, but he feels the need to clarify them in a way that the Ramban thinks is really, really distinct and significant for us. So let's start. The parasha begins, Vayidaber Elohim al Moshe vayomer elav ani Adonai. Vaera el Avraham el Yitzchak ve'el Yaakov be'el Shaddai u'shemi Adonai lo nodati lahem. They're classic psukim where you could translate every word, but the meaning, why is God telling us that he appeared to Avraham Yitzchak in the name Kel Shakai, but he didn't reveal him his true name? What's really going on in the psukim? So Rashi says, and the Ramban quotes Rashi, Lashon Rashi, Diber ito mishpat al shehiksha lomar uledaber lama harayot la'am hazeh. God was angry at Moshe for having said lama harayot la'am hazeh. Vayomer elav ani Hashem ne'eman lishalem sacha lamitalchim lifanai betamim. No, I'm going to reward those who follow me in complete belief. Ubelashon hazeh matzinu shu nidrash bekama mekamot va'ira al Avraham bekel shakai v'hivtachtiv harbe haftachot ubikulam amarti lahem ani kel shakai. Right? I use that name. Ushmi Hashem, the shame, the ineffable shame, Yud Kei Vav Kei, lo nodati lahem. And says the Ramban, quoting Rashi or not, it's a little hard to know. Lo hodati ein ksiv kan, ela lo nodati lahem, shelo nodati lahem b'mida amitit, sheli she'aleh nikra shmi Hashem. What is that name? Ne'eman la'amet hadvarim. Sharei hiftachtiv v'lo kiyamtim. Right? This is Rashi, meaning it's not that God promised and didn't fulfill because he broke his promise, God forbid, says the Ramban. No. What the Ramban explains is God promised, but the time for fulfillment of that promise didn't yet come. Avraham Avinu knew when God said, va'avadum v'yinu otam arba me'ot shana, he wouldn't see the end of that haftacha. Says the Ramban, v'yirtzeh lefaresh she'adayin lo noda kiyum ha'haftacha va'af al pi she'adayin lo higia hazman mikal makom lo noda lahem b'kiyum haftachato. Right? It's not, God forbid, that God wasn't honest with them. Of course he was. But they didn't live to see the fulfillment of that haftacha. Okay? And now he quotes the Ibn Ezra. And he says, V'inyan hakatuv, he's kind of explaining at the same time that he's quoting, V'inyan hakatuv, ki nireh la'avot b'shem Hashem, shehu minatseach ma'archot shamayim, v'la'asot imam nisim gidolim, shelo nitbatel mehem minhag ha'olam. Hard words to understand in the Ramban. I appeared to them, says the Ibn Ezra, or says the Ramban in understanding the Ibn Ezra, I appear to them as the menatzeach marchot shamayim, meaning God controls nature, God controls the world. But God can control the world in one of two ways. God can control the world by making a miracle. Yes, there's a rule that if I let go of this paper, it's going to fall. It's called gravity. God could overrule that anytime and anyhow and anywhere that he wants. And then there are the things that God controls that the Ramban refers to and really believes are nisim nistarim, right? Vayam shema tishma'u, then v'natatim et ha'artzechem bi'ito re'el malkosh. If you listen to the Torah, God will make it rain. And God forbid the opposite, right? God will bring a famine. Says the Ramban, there's nothing natural about if I daven in the morning, it's going to rain. There's nothing that connects those two things, except those are things that God controls as a nes nistar. We won't notice it. We don't have to notice it. But if we keep the Torah, good things will happen to us. Bira'av pada utam mimavet umilchama midei cherev. God did all these things for them. V'lateit lem oshe v'chavod v'chol tova v'hem kechol haYehudim shebatorah bibrachot u'biklalot. Ki lo tavo al adam tova b'schar mitzvah o ra'a ba'onesh aveira rak b'maaseh hanes. The fact that if I keep the Torah, good things will happen to me, says the Ramban, that's not natural. It's not unnatural. They're just unrelated. That's called a nes nistar. God will ensure that good things happen to me if I'm good. V'im yanuach ha'adam l'tivo o l'mazalo lo yosifu bo ma'asav davar v'lo yigru mimenu. However, if God lets the world play out, and so my astrological signs or the way the world was planned for me is X, so X will happen whether I keep the Torah or not. Aval schar kol haTorah va'onesh ba'olam hazeh hakol nisim vehem nistarim. Says the Ramban, when the world works the way it's supposed to, when God is good to us for keeping the Torah, that's a nes nistar. Yechashev bohem l'roim shehu minhago shel olam. Right? To the outsider, to anybody else who's just looking at the way the world works, okay, the world is working that way. He works hard, he's successful, so it's good for him. He keeps the Torah, but it doesn't have to be that way. V'heim ba'adam onesh v'sachar be'emet. Says Ramban, that's the real onesh and that's the real sachar. Zet ta'arich Torah biyudim sheba'olam hazeh v'lo tiva'er yiudei hanefesh ba'olam hanishamot. Why doesn't the Torah tell us that afterwards you'll go? This is like a very deep idea in the Ramban, which we're not going to really go into. But he says, why does the Torah tell us that when we pass away, the olam hanishamot is waiting for us, that our nishamot are going to be with God? Ki elam movtim shekineged hatolada v'kiyum hanefesh udveika ba'elokim hu davar ra'ui b'tolada shehu tashuv el elokim asher nitana. Says the Ramban, the most obvious thing in the world is that God gave us a nefesh, and when we die, that nefesh will return to God. What's not natural is that if I wear tzitzis today, it's going to rain. That's not natural, but we don't see that as a miracle because we don't see it that way. Okay? V'od afaresh ze im gomer Hashem alai. I want to explain more about this, says the Ramban. Now back to our point. V'hinei, amar ha'elokim l'Moshe, Nireiti la'avot b'koach yadi asher ani shoded b'hamazalot v'ozer li b'chirai. I appeared to the avos as somebody who controls nature, quietly, secretly, but does good things for his people. Aval bishmi shel yud kei asher bo nihiyeh kol hoveh lo nodati lahem livro lahem chadashar. I didn't do open miracles for them. Uv'shinui ha'toladot. V'lachein emor livnei Yisrael ani Hashem v'todia lahem pa'am acheret Hashem hagadol ki bo ani oseh imohem lahafli v'yedu ki ani Hashem oseh kol. No, but for you, tell the Jewish people, I'm going to do open miracles for them in a way that cannot be doubted by anybody. Okay, then the Ramban continues, and I think it's important, but, just one great line. V'tzadku kol divrei Rabbi Avraham b'inyan hazeh. Says Ramban, all the things that the Ibn Ezra says about the two types of miracles and God's role in the world, of course they're true. Ela shehu kimitnabeh ve'eino yodea. It's like he's a Navi, he has these insights, but he doesn't really understand them. And then the Ramban explains the Kabbalah. Now let's go to the end of the piece. He says the Ramban at the end here, Gam ha-midrash hazeh inyano mityashev achar ha-mikra. Ki huksha lahem lama yazkir nevuat ha'avot lepachot ma'alatam b'nevuah. Why would God appear to Moshe Rabbeinu and say, the avos only got nevuah up to here, but you're getting beyond that? V'lomar shelo nira alehem rak b'kel shakai. Why would he even implicitly insult the avot? Matzorech haya lo zeh haya ra'u lomar ani Hashem V'lachein emor livnei Yisrael ani Hashem, v'hotzeiti etchem v'idatem ki ani Hashem hamotzi. He could have just said it in a positive way. V'lachein, right? The Ramban wants to know, where does this idea come from that Chazal are so focused on the Shemos of Hashem? And, why did he have to say, I didn't appear to the Avos this way, I appeared to them that way? V'lachein yidrishu, ki haya hadavar tochacha leMoshe le'mor lo. Right? God is ki'ilu criticizing Moshe Rabbeinu. Hine ha'avot shelo higi'a lahem ma'alatam b'nevuah elecha v'lo ra'u rak b'kel shakai. People came before you, Moshe Rabbeinu. They didn't reach your level of nevuah. They only saw God as the shem kel shakai. Heim ha'aminu bi, but they believed in me. They had complete belief. V'gam hakimot yet briti itam v'shamati na'akat b'nehem ba'avuram. I'm hearing Bnei Yisrael because of them, not because of you, Moshe. Af ki atashi adati b'shem hagadol v'hiftachticha bo, sheyeshcha livtoch b'rachamim u'lavtiach Yisrael b'shmi she'aseh imahem otot u'moftim, v'gam ze nachon v'hagun. Right? God is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, you may be the greatest Navi ever, but at this point in your life, you don't have the belief, you don't have the trust, the way the Avos believed in me, the way the Avos trusted me. It's a harsh thing to say to Moshe Rabbeinu, but what the Ramban is saying is, all the stuff that's going on in the first few psukim of our parasha, they have deep meaning. And the deep meaning is that God is saying, I control the world in two ways. One is the secret way, right? The nisim nistarim. One and the other is nisim gluyim. Nisim nistarim, that's the shem kel shakai. That's what I did for Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Nisim gluyim, that's what I'm going to do for you. But Moshe, stop being so difficult. Trust me. The Avos trusted me. You have to trust me. I often think that Moshe Rabbeinu's, his problem in trusting HaKadosh Baruch Hu wasn't, God forbid, a lack of emunah. It was the suffering of Bnei Yisrael. Right? The Avos didn't really have that. It wasn't like, they were suffering in slavery and therefore God had to redeem them. I think Moshe Rabbeinu feels the pain of Klal Yisrael in a way that doesn't allow him to be as patient as HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants him to be. Okay, that's just an idea, but that's really, really a big idea in the Ramban in the beginning of the parasha. Now we come to an even bigger problem. Perek Zayin, Pasuk Gimel. Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu as follows. Okay, I sent you the Paroh, Atat Daberet, Kol, okay. Va'ani akshe et leiv Paroh, says God, I will harden Paroh's heart, v'hir beitiet ototai vet movtai be'eretz Mitzrayim, and I will then therefore make great and big miracles in Egypt. Obviously, for all of us, but for the Ramban in particular, va'ani akshe et leiv Paroh is a problem. The Ramban is a big, big believer in bechira chavshis. We all are. Now, why is Bechira, just as by way of introduction, why is Bechira Chavshis so important? So the answer is, without Bechira Chavshis, you can't have something else that's critical to who we are as Jews, and that's Schar Va'onesh. If I don't have free will, so on what basis would God reward me if I do mitzvos, and on what basis would God punish me if I don't? So those two things are contingent one on the other. And now the Ramban says, Perek Zayin Pasuk Gimel, Amru b'Medrash Rabbah, Gilalo shehu atid lechazek et libo ba'avur lasot bo hadin, tachat shehavidam ba'avodah kasha. It wasn't that God actually was doing it right now. The beginning of the Ramban is a little unclear, but God was saying eventually He's going to harden Paroh's heart. Va'od sham, ki ani hichbadeti et libo, Rabbi Yochanan, mikan pitchon pel leminim lomar, lo hayta mimenu shi'aseh tshuva. Paroh had never had a chance to do tshuva. And the Ramban doesn't respect this. Amr Shimon ben Lakish, Yisa same PM shall minim, shut them up. Ela im leitzim hu yalitz, matrebo pam rishana ushniya ushlishit veino chozer bo, v'hu noel bo delet min hatshuva k'dei lifra mimenu mashechata. No, he gives him a chance to do tshuva once, twice, three times. If he doesn't take advantage of it, yes, then he stops him at that point. Kach Paroh harasha. Kevan sheshiger HaKadosh Baruch Hu etzlo chamesh pa'amim v'lo yishgiach al divarav. Right, that's a Rashi who says the first 5 times it just says vayechazak leiv Paroh. It happened to him. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu ata hiksheita et arpecha V'hichbadetat libcha, you on your own harden your own heart. Hareini mosif lecha tumal tumatecha. Okay, I'll make it even worse for you. That's the introduction. Now says the Ramban, Vihine, Perush b'sheila asher yishalu hakol. And I think the Ramban is medayik when he says asher yishalu hakol. He says, when I go to shul, he's not just talking about Rashi and the Ibn Ezra. He says, when I go to shul, everybody asks me, how could God take away paras b'chira chavshis? How would that work? Im Hashem hikshad libo ma pisho. Right? If God hardened his heart, so Paroh didn't have a choice. So why is he punished for it? And says the Ramban, V'yesh bo shnei ta'amim u'shnehem emet. Classic Ramban. Two different answers, and they're both true. Ha'echad, the first answer. Ki Paroh birisho asher asa liYisrael ra'ot gedolot chinam. Paroh was a bad person, having nothing to do with va'ani akshet leiv Paroh. Up to this point, Paroh did horrific things to Klal Yisrael. Nitchayev limnoa mimenu darkei tshuva. The punishment for being such an evil person is that you lose your free will. Kasher ba'u b'zeh psukim rabim b'torah b'ktuvim u'lefi ma'asav harishonim nidon. And the Ramban, I think what he's saying here is u'lefi ma'asav harishonim nidon. If in order to have schar va'onesh, you need b'chira chavshis, so it's true. It would be unfair for God to punish Paroh for anything he did after he took away his free will. So says the Ramban, he doesn't, right? Let's assume for a second that, the scale of evil is 0 to 100. If you're the worst person in the world, I don't know, maybe you get to 80 or 90. Most of us live in some regular number, on the scale of evil. So most of us are bothered by this. I thought ad yom moto techak Elohim yashuv miyad tekablo. God will accept my tshuva for at any point in my life, even at the very end of my life. But think about it for a second. I think to myself, I very much want to, go to Olam Haba. I don't know if I will, but I very much want to go. When I get there, if I get there, I don't want to meet Yechia Sinwar and find that he's my roommate. He's an evil person. I don't find at the very last second of his life, before he died, even though we have the end of his life on drone video, I don't find that he did tshuva then. He deserves to be punished. So says the Ramban, when you pass a certain point on the evil scale, you can no longer do tshuva because you're so bad, because you did so many terrible things. Part of your punishment is God says, no, I'm not letting you do tshuva anymore. You earned a 90 on the evil scale, and that's where you are. It's true. Going forward, once God suspends your free will, he can't reward you and he can't punish you. But he can keep you at that point. And if you're bad enough, that's what he does. That's the first answer. So the first answer is yes. Generally speaking, people have free will. Sometimes when you're so evil, God suspends your free will. He doesn't punish you after that, but he suspends it, and that's part of the punishment. That's the first answer, which the Ramban thinks is true. Then he has a second answer. The second answer is Vatam Hasheni. Ki hayu chatzi hamakot alav b'pisho. No, it's not true that God suspended Paroh's free will. Paroh 5 times had the opportunity to do tshuva. Ki lo ne'emar bohem rak vayechazak leiv Paroh vayachbeid Paroh at libo. Doesn't say God did it. Paroh did it. V'hinei lo ratzah l'shalchem l'chvod Hashem. Right? Paroh did not want to send the Jewish people out from Egypt for God's purposes. Aval kasher gavru hamakot alav v'nila lispolotam. But as the makos piled up and Paroh suffered more and more, rach libo, his heart, literally the opposite of vayakshet libo, his heart became soft. V'hayan nimlach l'shalcham mikoved hamakot. He just wanted to get rid of the makos, so he was willing to give in. But says the Ramban, here's the main point. Lo la'asot ritzon baro. He wasn't doing it because of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He wasn't acknowledging the truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He wasn't acknowledging that there is a God that's above all the gods that Paroh served. He just wanted the makos to stop it. That wasn't enough. V'az hiksha Hashem et rucho v'imetz et levavo leman saper shemo. God wanted more. So God took away his free will to get to that point. Kinyan shekatov v'hit gadalti v'hit kadashti v'noadati le'inei goyim rabim. Right? The purpose of Yetzias Mitzrayim wasn't just taking the Jews out of Egypt. It was sort of an introduction of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the world. Everybody heard this. Everybody saw this. Everybody recognized there is one God, and He's the real God, and He really runs the world. So then how did God know this in advance? So He says, Yodia leMoshe ha'atid la'asot bo b'makot ha'achronot. Now He's telling Moshe what's going to happen at the end. Ki inyan shama v'ani yodati ki lo yitein etchem melech Mitzrayim lahaloch. That's a different problem in the philosophy of Judaism, which is, doesn't divine foreknowledge take away our free will? The Ramban here doesn't answer. He just says, no, God is saying what's going to happen because He knows what's going to happen. V'zeh ta'am v'ani akshet leiv Paroh v'hir beiti et ototai kilomar. She'akshe libo leman revot moftai be'eretz Yisrael. I'm doing it for a purpose. Ki b'chamesh makot ha'achronot gam b'tfiyat hayam ne'emar v'yichazek Hashem. Even at Yam Suf it says v'yichazek Hashem. Ki leiv melech biyad Hashem al kol asher yachpot yitenu. And says the Ramban, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as long as He went to the trouble of putting us in Egypt and taking us out, He wanted people to know Him. He wanted it to be a big deal. And therefore He didn't want Paroh to do tshuva at the end, because He wanted Paroh to acknowledge Him. It wasn't enough that God was taking us out of Egypt. He was taking us out of the control of Paroh directly into the control of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's a critical element of Yetzias Mitzrayim that I think we don't focus on enough. Says the Ramban, that was enough to suspend Paroh's free will. Because Paroh wasn't really doing it for our purpose. Paroh wasn't doing it because He's a God. Paroh was doing it because he wanted the Makos to stop. And says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's not enough for me. I need you to do it because I am the God of the world. And if not, we're going to continue until at the end, that's in fact what Paroh does. Hashem tzadik v'ani v'ami harishaim. He acknowledges completely the truth of God's existence, and therefore God is at that point ready to let him go. Okay, one quick piece that we missed in the parasha, but I think it's important to point out. And in the flow of the parasha, I think all Mefarshim recognize this. Moshe complains to HaKadosh Baruch Hu about how He's only made it worse for the Jews since He came. And then God tells him to go to Paroh. And then out of nowhere, at the beginning of Sheni, Eile Rashi Beit Avotam B'nei Reuven B'chol Yisrael Chanochu Falu V'chason V'chami Eile Mishpachos Reuven. And of course that goes to Reuven, Shimon, and it gets to Levi. And it stops with the introduction of Moshe and Aharon, which is clearly the purpose of the psukim to begin with. But the interruption in the flow is something that we need to point out and we need to focus on. And there says the Ramban, Eile Rashi Beit Avotam, Lo Ratzah Katuv L'Hatchil Eile Shmot B'nei Levi L'Toldotam, which is the whole point, is really just Levi. So he says, no, the Torah doesn't want to start with Levi. Shelo Yira'eh Sheyeh Levi B'chor Hayachas Mikan Ve'elach L'Chvod Moshe. He doesn't want it to be that Levi becomes the B'chor, and Moshe and Aaron come from Shevet Levi, and therefore they take over everything that matters in Klal Yisrael. Aval Hizkir Achav Hagdolim Mimenu V'chihu Nimneh Shlishi. So it starts counting Bnei Yisrael. If you don't notice it, you don't really pay attention to it. Okay, obviously it starts with Reuven, then it goes to Shimon, then it goes to Levi. Then it stops suddenly at Levi. Okay, maybe you noticed it, maybe you didn't. V'izkir b'bnei Levi l'toldotam, ki b'Reuven v'Shimon lo izkir rak yardei Mitzrayim imahem. Uva Levi yazkir toldotav u'shnotav v'toldot avot haneviim u'shnotam lichvodam. Va'od, ki heim ba'atzmam chasidei alyon, ru'uyim l'saper bohem ke'avot ha'olam. Says the Ramban, when you look in the psukim, you'll see it broadly tells you the story or the lineage of Reuven and Shimon. When you get to Levi, it's much more specific. Levi, Kahas, Merari, and the sons and the grandsons and the nephews, and how it all branches out. Because, in fact, says the Ramban, that's the future. Levi is, in fact, the greatest Shevet at that point. And it makes sense for God to give us the lineage of Shevet Levi, like in Sefer Bereshis. He gives us the lineage of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, not just in shorthand, but in the form of longhand. even though we're here to learn Ramban, I just have to point out this what I think is obvious and what I've seen in later Mefarshim, which is among the lessons you learn from the lineage is the obvious one. And maybe we don't think about it enough. Moshe Rabbeinu was a human being. Yes, Moshe Rabbeinu was the Adon HaNeviim. But he had a father and his name was Amram, and he had a mother and her name was Yocheved, and he had a brother and his name was Aaron, and his sister and his name was Miriam. You know, not, God forbid, lahotzi milibam, that later on in history there's going to be a religion where somebody's going to claim that that person wasn't a human being. The Torah goes out of its way to make it absolutely clear to everyone that Moshe Rabbeinu was a human being. Now, he may have been the human being who was closest to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but he wasn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he didn't reach the level of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we need to remember that. The greatest person in the history of the world, and Moshe Rabbeinu was such a person, the greatest Navi and all these other things, but he was human. And by interrupting the narrative and giving us the lineage, I think subtly that's one of the things that the Torah is telling us. It appears in writing in other places, but that's just a separate point. Okay, one last Ramban very quickly. When you come to Perek Chet and you come to the Makov Arov, there's a strange pasuk there. God says he's going to bring the wild animals, whatever they are exactly. V'hifleiti bayom hahu et eretz Goshen asher ami omeid aleha levilti hayot sham arov leman teidea ki ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz. Right? There's going to be a special like miracle within miracle that Goshen's going to be saved and the Arov's not going to come there, and that will show that it's happening from HaKadosh Baruch Hu and not from some natural thing that's happening in the world. It sounds like there's something special going on here. And here the Ramban says something that maybe we could have said on our own. It's really just a common sense insight. Says the Ramban, Ba'avur hayot hamakot harishonot omdot. The first makot were stationary. Right? Dam is it just happens where it happens. Einenu pela sheyihiyu be'eretz Yisrael v'lo be'eretz Goshen. So it's no great wonder. Okay, it only happened to the Egyptians, not to the Jews. Aval zo makam mishulachat. The Arov, they travel. They go from place to place. V'ka'asher ya'alu achayot mima'onot arayot meharei nemirim v'yashchitu kol eretz Mitzrayim ra'ui haya b'tivam sheyavo gam be'eretz Goshen. If wild animals and lions and tigers and bears, oh my, run through Mitzrayim, so of course they'll run through Eretz Goshen. But they don't. It's in the middle of Egypt. Most of the Jews were in Eretz Goshen. Therefore, it's a bigger miracle that the Arov come into Mitzrayim, but it's as if there's a secret fence that's keeping them out of Goshen. Right? There's going to be a difference. There's going to be a distinction. You're going to see the difference between Egyptians and Jews. And it says also, Sha'afilu be'eretz Yisraim im yimtzu achayot ish Yehudi lo yazikuhu v'yochlu ha-mitzrim ki d'chsiv yishalach bahem arov v'yochlaim. Right? If a lion met a Jew in Mitzrayim, he didn't eat the Jew, but he did eat the Egyptian. That's a bigger miracle to point out the distinction between Jews and Egyptians, the distinction between the people that God chose, us, and the people who God used to punish us. Okay, so what we saw today was, the first Ramban, really this genius idea about the difference between Nisim Nistarim and Nisim Niglim, and that God is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, the Avot never saw Nisim Gluyim, and they believed in me, and it's a bit of a tochacha, but it's also an explanation that we're now entering a new stage in Jewish history, and that what's about to happen in Mitzrayim is not usual. What's about to happen in Mitzrayim, where God reveals himself, not just to the Jews, but to the entire world, right? That's a unique aspect of Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's not going to repeat itself consistently in history. The distinction between hidden miracles and open miracles, and the fact that we live in a world of Nisim Nistarim, we just have to believe in them. And if we do, we'll be rewarded for that. And, God criticizes Moshe Rabbeinu the idea of God, the explanation, two explanations for why God suspended Paroh's free will. Either it happens regularly if a person's evil enough, or God had a particular purpose here in doing so and letting the people know. And finally, v'ifleiti, the difference between the Jews and the Egyptians with respect to makas arov, and the interruption, the narrative between the conversation with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and all of a sudden the lineage of Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. The Ramban points out the obvious, that it was for the purposes of Levi, but the Torah didn't want to make that clear, so it started both with Reuven and Shimon, and then it came to Levi. And the side point that I think is also a very big deal is that Moshe Rabbeinu was a human being, and he had a lineage, and he had parents, he had brothers and sisters, and he was part of a shevet. Okay, let's stop here. Yashkach to everybody. Have a great, great week, and see you next week. Shabbat Shalom.